Before the sun rose on that final morning, the city was already awake. Smoke curled gently from hearths. Merchants counted their goods. Priests washed their hands in cool water and whispered the same prayers their fathers had whispered and their fathers before them. Children ran across stone courtyards, laughing, unaware that this laughter would never echo here again. Nothing in the air warned them. No trumpet of doom. No prophecy fulfilled. Just another ordinary day in a civilization that believed it would last forever. For centuries, this ancient society had mastered its world. Its people bent rivers to their will, carved mountains into temples, and turned mud into monuments. They mapped the stars, measured time, and wrote their history in stone, convinced that stone meant permanence. Kings ruled not only by force, but by divine right, claiming the gods themselves had chosen them to maintain order against chaos. And for generations, it seemed true. The seasons came. Harvests followed. Enemies were defeated. The world made sense. This civilization stood at the center of a vast network of trade routes. Caravans arrived from distant lands carrying copper, tin, obsidian, incense, and exotic woods. Ships hugged coastlines, guided by familiar stars, bringing grain, wine, oil, and stories of faraway kingdoms. The marketplaces rang with many languages, yet all transactions were recorded in the same careful script, pressed into clay or inked onto papyrus. Bureaucracy was the backbone of survival. Every harvest measured, every tax counted, every worker assigned a place in the great machine of the state. At the heart of the city rose temples and palaces, their walls painted in vivid colors now lost to time. These were not just buildings, they were statements. Proof that humans could impose order on nature. Priests climbed steep stairways to greet the sun. Scribes bent over tablets in cool rooms, recording offerings to gods whose names carried power. Soldiers trained in courtyards, shields polished, spears aligned, ready for wars that always seemed to come eventually, but never today. The people trusted their world because it had always worked. Floods had been predicted before. Droughts had been survived. Invasions had been repelled. The civilization had endured famines, dynastic struggles, and even plagues, emerging each time with scars but still standing. Memory itself became a shield. If their ancestors survived worse, surely they would too. Yet beneath the surface, invisible forces were gathering. The climate had begun to shift. Slowly, subtly, rains came later than expected. Rivers ran lower than the old records suggested they should. Farmers noticed, but farmers always notice. They adjusted planting schedules, dug deeper canals, prayed harder. Officials dismissed concerns, trusting averages recorded over centuries. 1 bad year meant nothing. 2 bad years meant coincidence. 3 bad years were still not enough to challenge a system that had ruled for generations. Far beyond the city walls, tectonic pressures built silently. Fault lines strained under the weight of continents pushing and pulling, movements measured not in days or years, but in geological patience. Deep underground, magma shifted. Heat built, gases expanded. No human eye could see it. No priest could interpret it. No scribe could record it, because it had not yet happened. Trade routes, once reliable, began to fray. A distant port failed to send its usual shipments. A caravan arrived weeks late, its guards nervous, its animals thin. Rumor spread of unrest in border regions. Not full rebellion, just disorder. Bandits, hungry villages, local conflicts sparked by scarcity. The central authority noted these disturbances and filed them away, confident that stability would return as it always had. Inside the palaces, politics continued. Rival factions whispered behind curtains. Succession disputes simmered. Power struggles consumed attention that might otherwise have been spent listening to the land itself. The gods were still honored, the rituals still precise, but faith had quietly become habit rather than fear. When rituals become routine, warnings lose their edge. Then came the night. Somewhere deep beneath the earth, pressure reached its limit. The ground shuddered, just slightly at first, like a giant turning in its sleep. Most people did not wake. A few dogs barked. Clay vessels rattled on shelves and settled again. By morning, life resumed as normal. No one recorded the tremor. No one marked it as an omen. Why would they? The earth had always moved from time to time. Hours later, the real shock struck. The ground heaved violently, throwing people from their feet. Stone walls cracked like dry wood. Towers that had stood for centuries twisted and collapsed in clouds of dust. The roar was deafening. Not just sound, but sensation, a tearing of the world itself. Streets split open. Canals shattered. Water poured where it was never meant to go, flooding lower districts, sweeping away carts, animals, and people alike. Those inside temples screamed as columns fell, crushing altars and statues of gods who did not intervene. Palaces became traps, roofs collapsing onto those who believed themselves safest behind thick walls. Fire broke out as cooking flames tipped over, spreading rapidly through wooden roofs and crowded neighborhoods. Smoke filled the air, turning daylight into twilight. Survivors stumbled into the streets, bleeding, blinded by dust, calling out names that would never be answered. The city that had taken generations to build was coming apart in minutes. But the disaster did not end there. Beyond the city, the same forces had struck the countryside. Fields cracked open. Irrigation systems collapsed. In some regions, the earthquake triggered landslides that buried entire villages. In others, rivers changed course overnight, abandoning canals that had fed crops for centuries. Along the coast, the sea withdrew suddenly, exposing the seabed in an eerie silence before turning as a wall of water that smashed harbors and ships, dragging them inland and scattering wreckage across the land. Communication failed. Messengers never arrived. Signal fires went unanswered. The carefully managed system of control dissolved instantly. Without records, without officials, without food distribution, the population panicked. People fled the city, but where could they go? The countryside was broken. Roads were destroyed. Bridges lay in ruins. In the days that followed, hunger arrived quickly. Storehouses had collapsed or burned. Grain was contaminated by floodwater and ash. Wells were clogged with debris or poisoned by saltwater intrusion. Disease spread among the injured and the displaced. Flies swarmed. The smell of death hung heavy in the air. Priests attempted to restore order, declaring days of fasting and prayer. Sacrifices were offered, more desperate each time. But faith alone could not rebuild canals or raise fallen walls. Soldiers, once disciplined, deserted their posts to search for their families or secure food. Authority evaporated. What made this collapse so sudden was not just a disaster itself, but how perfectly it struck at the civilization's foundations. The economy depended on surplus. The government depended on records. Religion depended on monumental spaces. When the monuments fell, belief cracked with them. When the records were buried, administration became impossible. When surplus vanished, survival turned individual. Within weeks, the city was nearly empty. Those who could leave did. Those who could not were buried beneath rubble or succumbed to hunger and disease. Fires burned unchecked, then died out when there was nothing left to consume. Silence returned, broken only by the wind moving through ruins. And then, remarkably, the world moved on. Neighboring societies heard fragments of the disaster, distorted by distance and fear. Some believed the gods had punished arrogance. Others saw opportunity, moving into abandoned territories cautiously, settling among ruins they did not build and could not fully understand. The language of the fallen civilization faded. Its writing system was forgotten. Its gods lost their names. Generations later, people walk among the ruins without knowing who had built them. Children played on toppled stones that once formed sacred walls. Shepherds used fallen columns as shelters from the sun. Travelers told stories of a lost people who angered the gods or vanished mysteriously overnight. Centuries passed. Sand covered streets. Forests reclaimed plazas. Rivers carved new paths through broken foundations. The memory of the collapse survived only as myth, stripped of detail, shaped by imagination. It would take modern scholars, digging carefully through layers of earth, to piece together what truly happened. Cracked walls aligned in the same direction. Burned layers trapped beneath collapsed roofs. Human remains frozen in moments of sudden death. Geological evidence of massive seismic events. pollen records showing abrupt climate stress, tablets left unfinished, dropped mid-sentence as the ground shook. Together, these silent clues told a story no ancient survivor ever wrote, a story of a civilization that did not slowly decline over centuries, but fell in a matter of days, a reminder that complexity can be strength, but also fragility, that systems built to last forever may depend on assumptions that hold only until the world changes without warning. The day this ancient civilization collapsed was not marked by prophecy or foresight. It began like any other day, under a familiar sun, in a city confident in its endurance. And by nightfall, a world had ended. Even now, as we study these ruins and marvel at their achievements, the lesson remains carved into broken stone. Civilizations do not always fall with a whisper over centuries. Sometimes they fall with a roar in a single day, leaving behind only questions, silence, and the haunting knowledge that permanence is always an illusion. Long after the dust settled, long after the fires burned themselves out, the collapse continued in quieter, more insidious ways. What the earthquake and floods had begun, time finished with patience and indifference. Survivors who fled carried fragments of memory with them, but memory fades when survival demands silence. Parents stopped telling stories of the old city because those stories fed grief, not hunger. Children grew up hearing only fragments, half legends of the place where stone touched the sky and gods once walked among men. Those who attempted to return found a landscape they barely recognized. Streets were buried or twisted beyond use. Familiar landmarks lay shattered, their meaning erased. A temple was no longer a temple when its roof lay open to the sky, and weeds grew where incense once burned. Without walls, without rituals, without records, the city ceased to function as a city. It became a graveyard too large to bury. The collapse of authority was absolute. Kings ruled through symbols as much as force, and every symbol of power had fallen. Thrones lay crushed beneath rubble. Royal seals were lost in mud and ash. Without the ability to collect taxes, distribute food, or enforce laws, the state simply stopped existing. No declaration marked its end. No final edict was issued. The civilization died the way a body dies when a heart stops. Suddenly, and without ceremony, trade partners waited for shipments that never arrived. At first, they assumed delays. Then they assumed deception. Finally, they sent envoys to return with unsettling news. Silence, ruins, and bones. The economic shock rippled outward. Workshops in distant cities closed. Artisans lost access to raw materials. Prices rose. Scarcity spread like a second disaster, proving that the collapse of one civilization can weaken many others without ever touching them directly. Nature, indifferent to human tragedy, adapted quickly. Animals wandered freely through abandoned streets. Birds nested in collapsed towers. Plants cracked stone apart root by root, erasing human geometry with organic patience. Within decades, the city was barely visible from a distance, its outlines softened by vegetation and sediment. What had once been the center of the world became a rumor beneath the soil. In the absence of written records, later generations filled the void with stories. Some said the gods destroyed the city in a single night for its arrogance. Others claimed the people vanished into the earth itself, swallowed whole as punishment for forgotten sins. Myths replace history, because myths are easier to carry than truth. Truth requires evidence. Myth requires only belief. Yet the evidence was always there, waiting. Buried beneath layers of destruction were clues left untouched by time. A child's toy trapped beneath a fallen wall. A pot of food left cooking, carbonized by sudden fire. A ledger recording grain distributions that abruptly ended midline. Human remains found huddled together, not arranged for burial, but frozen in desperation. These were not signs of gradual decay. They were fingerprints of catastrophe. Modern science would eventually reveal more. Isotope analysis showing abrupt dietary stress. Tree rings recording years of drought immediately following seismic devastation. Coastal sediments revealing sudden flooding far inland. Together, they painted a picture of cascading failure. One shock triggered another. Infrastructure collapsed. Food systems failed. Social order unraveled. What survived the disaster could not survive its consequences. This is what made the collapse without warning so devastating. The civilization had no redundancy. Its brilliance lay in efficiency, but efficiency leaves little room for error. When canals failed, there were no alternatives. When records were destroyed, knowledge died with them. When belief cracked, unity dissolved. Complexity magnified vulnerability. For centuries afterward, the region remained sparsely populated. Travelers avoided the ruins, fearing curses or restless spirits. Those who settled nearby scavenged stones for their own modest homes, unknowingly dismantling history piece by piece. Each reused block erased context, making it harder for future generations to understand what had once stood there. And still, the silence endured. The collapse of the civilization reminds us of an uncomfortable truth. Stability is often an illusion created by memory. We assume tomorrow will resemble yesterday, because it usually does. But history is filled with moments when that assumption proved fatal. Civilizations plan for wars, rebellions, and rivals. They rarely plan for the earth itself to turn against them in a single, unstoppable moment. What makes this story endure is not just the scale of destruction, but its suddenness. No slow decay to study. No gradual warning to heed. Just life interrupted. A reminder etched into stone and bone that human achievement, no matter how grand, rests on forces far beyond human control. The day the civilization collapsed, no one knew they were living through history's final chapter. They woke expecting continuity and went to sleep, or died at the end of a world. And perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson of all. Collapse does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as an ordinary day, until ground breaks open and reminds us how thin the line truly is between endurance and oblivion. Long after even the myths began to fade, the consequences of that single day still shaped the land. The collapse was not an ending, but a long shadow cast across centuries. What had once been a tightly organized world dissolved into scattered fragments of humanity, each group carrying only what it could remember and forgetting far more than it saved. In the region surrounding the ruined city, people reorganized into smaller communities. Villages replaced urban centers. Power shifted from centralized kings to local leaders whose authority depended on immediate survival rather than divine mandate. The grand idea of a unified civilization became impractical in a landscape where roads were broken, bridges gone, and trust fragile. History did not simply pause. It reset. Knowledge was among the greatest casualties. Techniques once mastered were lost within a generation. Architectural methods that had raised massive structures vanished because the specialists who knew them were dead or scattered. Writing systems grew simpler or disappeared entirely as literacy declined. When survival becomes a priority, abstraction fades. Songs replace records. Memory replaces archives. And memory, unlike stone, erodes quickly. Even religion transformed. The old gods, once housed in towering temples, became distant or suspect. Some believed the gods had abandoned humanity. Others believed humanity had failed the gods. New belief emerged, simpler, more personal, less tied to monuments and priesthoods. Shrines replaced temples. Local spirits replaced universal deities. Faith adapted because it had to. Centuries later, when new powers rose nearby, they encountered a landscape filled with ruins whose origins were unknown. These new societies stood in awe of the broken stones, attributing them to giants, gods, or legendary ancestors. The idea that ordinary humans, farmers, masons, scribes, had built such wonders was difficult to accept. The past grew exaggerated because its truth was no longer accessible. Archaeological layers show this clearly. Above the destruction layer lies a long period of simplicity. Smaller houses, cruder tools, fewer imports, limited trade. The sudden drop in complexity is unmistakable. It is the signature of collapse without recovery. Not a decline followed by renewal, but a fall followed by forgetting. Environmental recovery, however, told a different story. With canals broken and fields abandoned, nature reclaimed water and soil. Forests spread. Wildlife returned. Rivers followed their own paths again, unconstrained by human engineering. In this way, the collapse of civilization became the recovery of the natural world. The land healed itself even as human memory fractured. Modern researchers debate whether the civilization could have survived had the disaster struck differently. If the earthquake had been weaker, if the floods had spared the storehouses, if leadership had responded faster. But such questions miss the deeper truth. The civilization was not prepared for a failure of everything at once. Redundancy was minimal. Resilience was assumed, not tested. What makes this story resonate today is its relevance. Our own world is built on complex systems that function because they usually do. Power grids, supply chains, digital records, global trade, all miracles of organization, all vulnerable to sudden disruption. The ancient collapse is not just history. It is a mirror. The people of that lost civilization believed in continuity because continuity had always been their experience. Their mistake was not arrogance, but trust. Trust that the world would behave tomorrow as it did yesterday. Trust that the systems built by human hands were stronger than the forces beneath them. When the day came, there was no villain, no enemy army, no single decision that doomed them. There was only nature, pressure, and chance. The most terrifying collapses are not caused by intent, but by indifference. And so the ruins remain silent but eloquent. They speak of skill and ambition, of order and beauty, and of how quickly it can all vanish. They remind us that civilizations are stories we tell ourselves, held together by cooperation, belief, and fragile systems. When those systems break simultaneously, the story ends, not with conclusion, but with an abrupt silence. The day that ancient civilization collapsed without warning was not unique in history. It was simply one of the clearest examples. A moment when time itself seemed to snap, dividing the world into before and after. And in the space between those two moments, an entire way of life disappeared, leaving behind only stones, shadows, and the enduring question of how many other worlds have ended the same way, unnoticed by history until it was far too late. Even after centuries of abandonment, the collapse continued to shape human behavior in subtle, invisible ways. Paths avoided the ruins, not because anyone remembered the disaster clearly, but because fear lingered in tradition. Parents warned children not to wander among the broken stones. Travelers chose longer routes rather than camp near the silent city. Memory transformed into instinct, and instinct into custom. Occasionally, droughts or floods struck the region again, and elders would point to the ruins as proof of what happened when humans grew too confident. The story changed with each telling, but the warning remained. The past was no longer a source of pride, but a lesson whispered around fires at night. As centuries passed, entirely new civilizations rose elsewhere. They developed their own systems, their own gods, their own explanations for how the world worked. Some unknowingly repeated the same patterns: centralized control, tightly coupled infrastructure, dependence on predictable nature. Others deliberately avoided them, favoring flexibility over grandeur, survival over spectacle. History, even forgotten history, still influenced the future. When explorers and scholars eventually returned with curiosity rather than fear, they found a puzzle frozen in destruction. Streets ended abruptly. Walls leaned at unnatural angles. Entire neighborhoods showed no signs of rebuilding. This was not a city that declined slowly. It was a city that had been interrupted. Excavations revealed homes filled with everyday objects left behind, jewelry still on tables, tools set down mid-task, food storage jars unopened. These were not the remains of a planned evacuation. They were evidence of shock, of a population that never had the chance to decide what to save. Some discoveries were especially haunting. Skeletons found clasping one another, footprints preserved in ash leading nowhere, doorways blocked by collapsed stone where people had tried to escape. These moments bridged millennia, collapsing time itself, forcing the modern observer to confront the suddenness of the end. The collapse also challenged long-held assumptions about history. For generations, scholars believed civilizations fell slowly, worn down by corruption, invasion, or decay. But here was proof that complexity could vanish almost instantly, that sophistication offered no immunity, that progress did not guarantee survival. This realization reshaped how historians understood the past. It reframed collapse not as a failure of morality or leadership alone, but as a systemic vulnerability. When enough critical systems depend on one another, failure spreads faster than human response. What begins as a natural event becomes a social catastrophe. The ancient civilization had been efficient, interconnected, and powerful. Those qualities allowed it to dominate its world. But they also meant that when one element failed, many others followed. There was no gradual adaptation, no time to learn new ways. The margin between order and chaos was thinner than anyone realized. In time, even the name of the civilization disappeared. Inscriptions eroded. Languages evolved. Future empires built atop the ruins without knowing whose bones lay beneath their foundations. History does not preserve everything. It preserves what survives long enough to be remembered. Yet the silence itself became part of the record. Today, scientists use this collapse as a case study, not just of the past, but of human systems in general. It stands as evidence that resilience matters more than strength, that redundancy matters more than efficiency, and that warning signs are often visible only in hindsight. The ancient people never saw the end coming because it did not announce itself. It arrived as a chain reaction. One event triggered another and another until recovery was no longer possible. By the time the danger was clear, choice had vanished. That is why the story endures. Not because of the buildings or the kings or the gods, but because of its relevance. Because it forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that our own world, too, depends on fragile balances. That permanence is not guaranteed by greatness. That the past is not distant. It is instructional. The day that ancient civilization collapsed without warning was a reminder written not in words, but in absence. A reminder that even at the height of achievement, humanity remains bound to forces it cannot command, and that sometimes history does not end with a slow fading into darkness, but with a sudden break, one ordinary day, followed by silence. Long after scholars reconstructed the sequence of destruction, one truth remained impossible to calculate: how it felt to live through the final moments. Numbers can estimate population loss. Layers of ash can date the disaster. But fear, confusion, and disbelief leave no measurable trace. Those emotions existed only in living minds, and when those minds were gone, the experience vanished with them. Imagine the final hours for those who survived the first shock. Night fell over a city without light. Fires burned uncontrolled, casting trembling shadows across broken walls. The air was thick with dust and smoke, making every breath painful. Cries echoed from beneath rubble, growing weaker as hours passed. Some people dug with bare hands until their fingers bled. Others froze, unable to comprehend what had happened, staring at ruins that had once defined their identity. In those moments, the idea of civilization, laws, gods, hierarchy meant nothing. There was only instinct. Find water. Find family. Stay alive until morning. Many did not. At dawn, the sun rose on a landscape that no longer made sense. Familiar streets were gone. The skyline had collapsed into jagged silhouettes. Smoke drifted upward in slow columns, marking places where entire neighborhoods had burned through the night. The silence between distant cries was heavy, unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Survivors gathered in open spaces, afraid to enter any structure that still stood. Aftershocks rippled through the ground, sending panic through the crowd each time the earth trembled. With every shock, hope faded further. If the ground itself could not be trusted, what could? Attempts to restore order failed almost immediately. Leaders were missing or dead. Messengers could not navigate the ruins. Food distribution was impossible without records or intact storehouses. People argued, fought, and eventually separated into small groups, each convinced that survival depended on leaving rather than staying. The exodus was chaotic. Families carried what little they could salvage. The injured slowed entire groups, forcing impossible decisions. Some were left behind not out of cruelty, but exhaustion. Roads leading out of the city were clogged with debris and bodies. Bridges had collapsed. Travelers followed riverbanks or animal paths, moving without maps toward uncertain refuge. Those who escaped carried trauma rather than continuity. They could describe the city, but not recreate it. Knowledge passed down became fragmented. Measurements were forgotten. Techniques blurred. Precision gave way to approximation. Over time, the memory of how things were done mattered less than finding a way to do them at all. As generations passed, the disaster transformed from memory into identity. Descendants of survivors grew up with inherited caution. They built smaller. They avoided dense cities. They respected the land in ways their ancestors had not. Not from philosophy, but from fear passed down without explanation. This cultural shift was subtle, invisible to outsiders, but powerful. In this way, the collapse reshaped history far beyond the ruins. It altered migration patterns. It delayed urbanization in entire regions. It influenced which societies rose next and which never did. The absence of one civilization created space for others, just as silence allows new sounds to emerge. Eventually, even fear faded. New generations saw the ruins not as warnings, but as curiosities. Curiosity led to exploration. Exploration led to settlement. Stone by stone, the remains were dismantled and reused. The collapse was recycled into foundations for new homes, new walls, new lives, built without knowing the full weight of what lay beneath. And still, the moment itself remained frozen in the earth. Every time archaeologists uncover a collapsed doorway or a skeleton trapped beneath fallen masonry, they encounter the same instant, the same interruption, the same unanswered question of what that person was thinking when the world broke. These discoveries are not just data. They are echoes. The collapse without warning challenges one of humanity's deepest assumptions, that progress moves forward in a straight line. History shows it does not. It lurches. It breaks. It forgets. Entire world can exist, flourish, and vanish without leaving a clear explanation behind. This ancient civilization did not fail because it was weak. It failed because it was human, because it trusted patterns, relied on memory, and assumed tomorrow would arrive as expected. That assumption, shared by every civilization before and after, is both necessary for life and dangerous to survival. The final lesson of that day is not despair, but humility. The understanding that no matter how advanced society becomes, it exists at the mercy of forces it cannot negotiate with. Earthquakes do not care about achievements. Floods do not respect borders. Time does not preserve intention. And so the story continues, not as a closed chapter, but as a warning written into the ground itself. Somewhere beneath our feet, other cities lie buried. Other collapses waiting to be rediscovered. Each one reminds us that history is not only what endures, but what disappears suddenly, leaving behind silence where a world once stood. Even now, when the ruins are studied layer by layer, the most striking feature is not what is present, but what is missing. There is no sign of recovery, no rebuilding phase, no gradual return to order. The archaeological record jumps abruptly from complexity to absence, as if a hand simply wiped the slate clean. This absence speaks louder than any monument ever could. In many collapses, life continues in reduced form. People adapt. Systems shrink. Traditions endure in fragments. But here, continuity was severed. The break was too violent, too sudden. The social fabric tore beyond repair. When survivors scattered, they did not carry the full blueprint of their world with them. They carried memories, and memories alone cannot reconstruct a civilization. What followed was a long age of fragmentation. Small groups lived in isolation, rarely traveling far, rarely coordinating beyond immediate needs. Trade became local. Innovation slowed. The past became unreachable, not because it was forbidden, but because it was no longer understood. Without context, even preserved knowledge loses meaning. Some artifacts survived untouched for centuries. Sealed rooms, buried storerooms, hidden corners of the city never disturbed by scavengers or settlers. When these spaces are uncovered today, they feel intimate in a way monuments do not. They reveal domestic life paused mid-motion. A cup left beside a sleeping mat. Tools arranged carefully, as if their owner expected to return. These details strip away abstraction and remind us that collapse is not an event experienced by a civilization, but by individuals. The silence after the collapse was not empty. It was filled with adaptation. Human beings are remarkably resilient, even when systems fail. New societies emerge slowly, cautiously, shaped by a deep, unspoken memory of loss. They valued mobility over permanence, oral tradition over written record, flexibility over scale. These choices were not philosophical. They were practical responses to a world proven unstable. Over time, the land itself became an archive. Soil layers recorded fire and flood. Sediments captured sudden changes in water flow. Pollen traces revealed abandoned fields returning to wild growth. The earth remembered what humans forgot. Long after languages vanished, the ground still held the story. Modern technology has allowed us to listen to that story. Seismic modeling, climate reconstruction, remote sensing that reveals buried streets invisible to the naked eye. Each advancement brings us closer to understanding not just what happened, but how narrow the margin was between survival and disappearance. How a slightly different sequence of events might have allowed recovery, or delayed collapse by only a generation. Yet no matter how precise the data becomes, one element will always remain unknowable: the moment when realization set in, the instant when someone understood that this was not a temporary disaster, but the end, that everything familiar, identity, order, future, had been erased in hours. That realization, if it came at all, came too late to matter. The civilization collapsed without warning, because warning requires time. Time to observe patterns. Time to debate responses. Time to change course. Catastrophe removed time from the equation. It forced decisions at the speed of instinct, and instinct alone cannot preserve complexity. This is why the story refuses to fade. Not because it is unique, but because it is possible. Because it has happened before and could happen again. Anywhere humans build systems that assume stability as a constant rather than a condition, the ruins do not accuse. They do not moralize. They simply exist, bearing witness to a moment when the continuity of life was broken so completely that even memory could not bridge the gap. They remind us that civilizations are not eternal structures, but temporary arrangements, fragile agreements between people, nature, and time. And when that agreement is broken without warning, all that remains is aftermath. Stone without voices, streets without footsteps, names without meaning. A world that ended not with farewell, but with an interruption so complete that history itself hesitated before moving on. Long after the interruption became history, the question still lingered in the silence of the ruins. How close had they been to survival? The answer, buried in layers of earth and time, suggests something deeply unsettling. They were not far at all. The civilization stood at the peak of its knowledge, wealth, and organization. It did not collapse because it lacked intelligence or skill. It collapsed because it lacked time. In the final years before the disaster, subtle adaptations were already underway. New canal branches had been planned. Granaries were being expanded. Records show adjustments to crop ratios. Hints that officials sense instability, even if they did not fully understand it. These were rational responses to stress, but rational responses require continuity. They assume tomorrow exists. The catastrophe erased that assumption. When continuity vanished, progress reversed instantly. Skills that took centuries to refine disappeared in a single generation. Mathematical systems, once essential to taxation and engineering, became irrelevant to daily survival. Precision no longer fed families. Simplicity did. Knowledge that could not be immediately applied was abandoned, not because it was wrong, but because it was impractical. This is how advanced worlds disappear. Not in flames alone, but in choices forced by desperation. Over generations, descendants of survivors adapted to smaller horizons. They measured time by seasons rather than calendars. They built with materials that could be replaced easily. They avoided investing too heavily in any one location. Mobility became security. Memory became caution. The land was no longer something to dominate, but something to negotiate with. Ironically, this made later societies more resilient in some ways than the one that collapsed. They endured hardship by expecting it. They survived uncertainty by designing for it. Yet they paid a price as well. Without large-scale cooperation, innovation slowed. Art became simpler. Architecture became modest. The dream of permanence was abandoned. The ruin stood as a contradiction. Proof that greatness was possible, and proof that it was dangerous. At times, new leaders attempted to revive fragments of the old order. They tried to rebuild cities, reinstate centralized authority, resurrect lost rituals. But without the deep institutional memory that once supported those systems, efforts failed. A palace without bureaucracy is just a large house. A temple without belief is just stone. Fort without function collapses under its own weight. Centuries later, when writing returned to the region in new forms, scribes encountered the ruins with fresh eyes. They copied symbols they did not understand. They incorporated ancient stones into new inscriptions, unknowingly merging two eras separated by catastrophe. History became layered, not continuous. A broken conversation between past and present. What makes this collapse particularly haunting is how ordinary it began. There was no final celebration, no last great war, no conscious ending. People went to sleep believing in tomorrow. That belief was not foolish. It was human. Every civilization depends on it. The ground did not care. The earth moved according to pressures that ignore borders, gods, and empires. The river followed gravity, not tradition. Fire spread according to wind, not law. The collapse was not an act of judgment. It was an act of physics. And yet, meaning emerged anyway. Humans are meaning-making creatures. We cannot accept randomness easily. So the collapse was explained, retold, reshaped. It became a story of pride or punishment or destiny. These explanations were not accurate, but they were necessary. They gave survivors a framework to continue living in a world that had proven itself unpredictable. Even today, when we explain such collapses in scientific terms, we are still searching for reassurance. We want to believe that understanding equals control, that if we can model the past, we can avoid repeating it. But the deeper lesson is more uncomfortable. Understanding reduces risk. It does not eliminate it. The ancient civilization collapsed without warning because warning systems themselves depend on stability. Sensors, records, communication, trust, all must function simultaneously. When stress accumulates across multiple systems, failure becomes nonlinear. It accelerates. By the time collapse is visible, it is already complete. This is why the ruins feel timeless. They are not relics of ignorance, but of ambition. They represent a moment when humanity reached outward and upward, believing it had mastered its environment, only to be reminded that mastery is temporary. As the sun sets over broken walls and eroded streets, shadows stretch across stones laid by hands long turned to dust. The city does not speak, but it does not need to. Its message is written in absence. Civilizations are not destroyed only by enemies. They can be ended by moments, brief, violent, in different moments that rewrite history faster than memory can adapt. When those moments pass, what remains is not just ruin, but a warning preserved in silence. A reminder that every world, no matter how advanced, exists one ordinary day away from becoming a forgotten one. In the end, what defines this collapse is not only what was lost, but how completely it vanished from the rhythm of human time. There was no gradual transition from old to new, no bridge between eras. One generation belonged to a thriving world. The next inherited a landscape of fragments. History usually moves like a river, bending and branching. Here it broke like glass. The final survivors did not think of themselves as living after collapse. They thought of themselves as living after disaster, still waiting for recovery. At first, they believed the city could be rebuilt. Stones could be cleared, walls raised again. But with each passing season, reality set in. The workforce was gone. The knowledge was gone. The confidence was gone. Rebuilding was not just difficult. It was unimaginable. Hope narrowed. Ambition shrank. The future became shorter. The psychological collapse mattered as much as a physical one. Civilizations persist not only through infrastructure, but through belief in continuity. When that belief dies, organization dissolves. People stop planning for decades and start planning for days. That shift, once made, is almost impossible to reverse. The land remembered what humans could not. Fault lines settled back into stillness. Rivers carved new, stable paths. Forests thickened where streets once lay. Nature found balance again, indifferent to the absence of cities. From the Earth's perspective, nothing had gone wrong. Pressure released. Systems reset. Life continued. Human time, however, had been shattered. Centuries later, when the ruins were finally understood as the remains of a lost civilization rather than the work of myth, the realization was sobering. This was not a primitive society overwhelmed by forces it could not comprehend. It was a sophisticated world, confident, adaptive, and intelligent. It had done almost everything right, and still disappeared. That is why its story matters. It teaches that collapse does not require ignorance, corruption, or moral failure. Sometimes, it requires only coincidence, a convergence of stress, timing, and vulnerability. A single day where multiple systems fail together, leaving no room for recovery. The ancient civilization collapsed without warning, because warning assumes repetition. It assumes the future resembles the past closely enough to prepare for it. But the most dangerous events are those that fall outside experience, those that arrive once, decisively, and never repeat. As we stand at a distance of centuries, the ruins feel permanent, but even they are fading. Wind erodes inscriptions. Roots fracture stone. One day, even the evidence of collapse will disappear, and the land will carry the memory alone. Yet the lesson will persist, carried forward not by monuments, but by awareness that civilizations are achievements, not guarantees. That complexity is powerful, but fragile. That history can change not only through long struggles, but through moments so sudden they feel unreal. The day that ancient civilization collapsed without warning was not just an ending. It was a reminder, etched into the earth, that every world humans build exists in balance with forces beyond them. And when that balance breaks, history does not pause to explain. It simply moves on,